Charles thought a lot of those fish. He took them down regularly to change the water, feed them and admire them. Marvellous little chaps they were, he assured them. He was going to build them a new pond all to themselves. Actually, there was very nearly no need to. The same night that Seeley was stalked by the magpies, Seeley in turn found the fish. On the kitchen table where Charles had left them while he came in to have his supper, and where, when we went out, Seeley was happily fishing. He was standing with one front foot actually in the bowl of fish, and the other paw poised to strike. He hadn't caught any yet, though the fishing paw was wet and had obviously been in the water pretty often, and he couldn't understand why we yelled and grabbed him. Spoiling all his fun, he wailed as I bore him away. Didn't like him doing anything. Bet we were in league with those silly old magpies. From then on, we had to keep a wire cake tray permanently on top of the fishbowl. Remember never to leave it on the table, and keep a watchful eye on the cupboard to make sure Seeley hadn't found a way of climbing up it. This was indoors, as at the same time we had to make sure he wasn't chasing Sheba, and, if outdoors, that he wasn't wandering off or stalking bees. Life, like the weather, was certainly warming up. The qualms I'd had about our own bees had happily resolved themselves. Charles had gone up early in the year to see if they needed feeding, and found that they just weren't there. The most likely explanation, seeing that there were no dead bees in the hive and all the honey had gone, was that the bees from one of the stranger hives up the valley had come on a raiding expedition, as bees sometimes do if they are close to a weakened hive, and that, as again, has been known to happen. Our bees, instead of fighting them, had matily gone off to join them, taking their honey stores with them. It was the best thing that could have happened in the circumstances. There were the bees up the valley to pollinate Charles's fruit trees. Charles wasn't likely to be stung anymore, with the other hive so far away. Seeley, I sighed with relief, was never likely to come across a hive at all, not one with bees in it anyway, though our own hive still stood empty on the hill. Better get down fast, advised Father Adams, before the bee swarms further up and comes back down here to live. There wasn't much fear of that, however. The man who kept the other bees was an expert. We had to watch Seeley with the ordinary bees around the garden, but there was nothing like as many as there would have been. Seeley, of course, never having seen a bee before, was absolutely entranced to have so many exciting playmates. He stalked them on his stomach. He leapt after them through the air. He flattened all the crocuses, making frustrated pounces. The main thing was to stop him picking one up in his mouth. If one stung him on the paw, he'd learn to leave him alone. But a sting in the mouth can be dangerous. Olive oil was the best quick first aid if that happened, I'd read, applied with a feather if the bee sting was in the throat. So I kept a feather and the oil bottle handy, hoped I'd never have to use it, and meanwhile kept on running. Out to fetch him back from the lane, up to fetch him back from the hillside, out once more because he was now after a bee, a bumblebee this time, and it was slower and he almost caught it. Didn't want him to have any fun at all, wailed Seeley as I carted him back to where I was weeding a border. It wasn't that. It was that I wanted to know he was safe. In the end, all our precautions were in vain, however. Seeley was bitten by an adder. Chapter 15. He met up with it in Annabel's field behind the cottage, the one place we'd thought, since she patrolled it so solidly and the grass was down to billiard table level, was completely adder-free. Charles actually saw it happen, though he didn't know then that it was an adder. He was cementing a gatepost. I was mowing the lawn. We were keeping an eye open for Seeley, who we knew was up there somewhere. It was Charles who saw him come out of the trees at the top of the field, amble a few yards down one of the paths. and then crouch, flatten his ears, and pounce at something. A bee, Charles thought at the time, but we weren't so worried about bees now, seeing that Seeley hadn't so far managed to catch one. A moment or two later, he said he could hear a cat crying. And where was Sheba? Indoors, I said. I couldn't hear the crying myself on account of the noise of the mower. And then Charles said suddenly, quick, it's Seeley, and was in the lane and up the hillside like a flash. Seeley tried to walk to him, but could only stumble. And all the time we could hear this dreadful crying. He was still crying, crying with every breath he took in a frightening monotone. When Charles got him down to me at the gate, his paw was already huge, and there was something that looked like water oozing from it. We carried him in and put him on the table, hoping against hope it might be a bee sting. Seeley couldn't stand up by now, and still he was crying, crying, crying. My own heart nearly stopped beating. I said, oh my goodness, it's an adder. Somehow we telephoned the vet. Get him over as fast as we could, he said. It was quicker for us to go to him than for him to come to us. He'd have everything ready at the surgery. Somehow we got the car out and Seeley into his basket and was speeding up the hill. We hadn't stopped for anything. We were still in our old gardening clothes. I hadn't even washed my hands, but they were covered in earth. Halfway to the surgery, Seeley suddenly quietened. He was looking at me with big, round eyes, but he didn't appear to be quite so frightened. I bet it was a bee sting after all, I said, and we've been making all this fuss for nothing. The vet didn't think so. That's pretty big for a bee sting, he said, examining a paw which was now swollen up to Seeley's shoulder. And when I said, but wouldn't Seeley have been unconscious by now if it really had been an adder? He said, not necessarily. In his experience, he said cats and dogs had more resistance to adder bite than was generally supposed. Some did die within a very short time if, for instance, they were bitten on the mouth. But if they were bitten in the foot, like Seeley, he'd known a good many of them to recover. It was shock we had to guard against, he said. It was half an hour since Seeley had been bitten, and he hadn't yet collapsed. He'd give him a cortisone injection, and we'd keep our fingers crossed. Take him home, bathe, and keep on bathing his paw in water as hot as he could stand it. And if Seeley did collapse, we were to call him at once. Seeley didn't collapse, though. When we got him home and out of his basket, and I saw the size of his leg, I was pretty near it myself. He wouldn't have his paw bathed either. It hurt, he said, and rushed to hide under the table. So not knowing whether we were doing right, but remembering that with adder bite in humans, one is supposed to keep the patient still to prevent the venom circulating, we abandoned that and put him on our bed in his favourite refuge, the nest of sweaters, with a hot water bottle in it to keep him warm. Years before, Sheba had had a swollen paw, and we thought it might have been an adder, and the vet had given her antihistamine. They didn't give antihistamine now, he explained in the surgery. Some cats reacted to it badly. They didn't give snake serum either. Some cats reacted to that. They'd found it best to treat them for shock. All I knew, looking at Seeley lying quiet against his bottle, his paw stretched out before him like a furry black bolster, was that Sheba's paw had never swollen like that. Huge it was now, and when I touched his shoulder, he cried. Either Sheba's bite hadn't been from an adder, or was cortisone enough? It was. Our vet, as usual, knew what he was doing. Seeley's leg was so swollen that at one time it must have been at least 4 times its normal diameter. It couldn't get any bigger without bursting, I said, looking at it despairingly. But Seeley didn't collapse. When at 3 a.m. we got up to see how he was sitting up himself, looking at us alertly, and we could see the shape of his leg. It was still badly swollen, and the paw on the end of it was gross, but at least it didn't look so much like a policeman's truncheon. By midday, it was down still further. By evening, he could walk on it, though still with a decided limp. We ourselves were still shaken by the narrow squeak he'd had. "No more putting it off," said Charles. "We'd better build that cage." We did. We also, for Annabel's sake, scored her field for signs of the adder, but we couldn't find it. How was it she'd never trodden on one if they were up there, I asked. "Because of the ground vibration when she walked," said Charles. "An adder would hear her coming and slip away before she reached it. But Seeley's light little tread wouldn't have disturbed it at all. The water from Seeley's paw, that," said the vet, "had been serum, the liquid that is left when blood coagulates." We hadn't seen that with Sheba, as we realised when we thought about it. There wasn't much doubt that Seeley had crossed swords with an adder. So we erected his cage. "A temporary one," said Charles. "He'd put it up properly later. The main thing at the moment was to get some protection up fast." It was, as it needs to be with a Siamese, a big cage, about 12 feet by 6 and 5 feet high, consisting of 4 iron stakes sunk into the lawn with inch mesh wire netting fixed round it. The final cage would also have a wire netting roof, but that needed crossbars to support it. For the moment, until we had time to make the crossbars, we covered it with one of Charles's fruit nets, an unbreakable nylon one of which he'd just bought several dozen to replace the frost coverings. The frost danger was over, Charles had reported, but now the blasted birds were at the blossom. And how they were! Bullfinches, blue tits, wood pigeons, they were up in the orchard in droves. The wood pigeons only attacked the cherry trees, but the small birds were everywhere at once. They'd never seen such blossom, obviously, thanks to Charles's frost coverings, which had protected it. That, putting up the nets, sometimes several nets to a tree if it was a large one, and it had to be done, said Charles. Several of the trees were already completely stripped, was why Seeley's adder cage was only a temporary one. Charles needed all his time to put up the nets. So I draped the fruit net roof over the cage myself, tying it every few inches with string, and put Seeley inside for a tryout. He protested immediately. "Incarcerated! Send for the police! Claustrophobia!" he roared, sitting bolt upright inside the wire and proceeding to bawl his head off. He couldn't get out though. We'd fixed the bottom wire down with tent pegs, and inspect it though he might, he couldn't pull that up. He wasn't going to be in it permanently, of course, just for an hour or so, when there might be adders about, when it was a shame to shut him indoors, but we didn't have time to watch him. All was well the first day. "Thought he was going to be shut in there forever," he complained when I let him out again, but it didn't seem to have worried him overmuch. All seemed well the second day too. Seeley was in his cage. Sheba, who liked it really warm, was sleeping in the car. I, with tranquillity of mind at last, was getting on with some writing. Tranquillity as to where he was, that is, not tranquillity as far as sound went, since Seeley, for nearly an hour, had been howling with every breath. At last, all was peaceful, however. He was getting used to it at last, I thought, and looked up, right at that moment, to find him sitting triumphantly on the floor beside me. He'd climbed the wire adjoining one of the corner poles where it was taut, and while clinging to it, had pushed his way out under the net. That we could tell from the turned-back piece of fruit netting. So I ran string through the netting on the corner, as if I was sewing it, congratulated myself next day when I saw its little bullet head thrusting vainly against the roof, while he clung to the wire like a monkey, that I'd foiled that attempt at a breakthrough. And half an hour later, looking out through the window from my typewriter, there he was, proceeding across the lawn. "Got out through the other corner," he announced triumphantly when he saw me. And sure enough, When I went out, the fruit netting was pushed back by the other pole. At least, I thought, firmly lacing up that escape hatch, he wouldn't try getting out through the back. He wouldn't realise it was possible to get out through there. At his age, he couldn't have that much intelligence. He had, though. Twice more he emerged, like a little black Houdini, until I'd laced down all four corners, and for good measure, all round the sides as well. Now he couldn't get out. In fact, as the weather was warmer, we put Sheba in with him for company, and he didn't want to get out. They had a rug in there, their water bowl, plate of food, and an earth box, the latter two to meet Celia's requirements, and at last we had some peace. People spotted the cage through the trees and began to speculate, of course. "Wonder what they've got in there," said one. "Looks like they'd be keeping rabbits now," said another. "That's to stop the new one from getting bitten," said somebody else who'd obviously heard about the adder. Miss Wellington had heard about it too. She was now going around in slacks. On account of the snakes, she told the postman, and though there was no reason why she shouldn't wear slacks, people much older than she wore them nowadays, though not usually in psychedelic pink, villages being what they are, and Miss Wellington having hitherto been seen only in long tweed skirts except in high summer when she wore long and drooping voiles, there was certainly some excitement over that. "They old snakes had better watch out or they'll die of shock when they see she," opinioned Fred Ferry. "Got her eye on old Bill Porter, I reckon," said Father Adams. Bill Porter being a widower and well over 80. "Not if I see she first," said Bill Porter when they chaffed him, while Miss Wellington tripped skittishly in her slacks among her toadstools. We, meanwhile, having solved the problem of keeping Seeley safe for a guaranteed hour or two a day, still had to keep watch on him when he wasn't in the cage. He couldn't be locked up all the time. He had to have his periods of freedom, and have such periods he did, while I walked with him in the forestry lane, sat patiently near him while he investigated the hedgerows, and played happy games of tag with him in the grass. "He ought to learn to stay in the garden sometimes, though," said Charles. "Not be like Solomon, always out through the gate." So the next thing that appeared on the lawn was a permanent pile of pea sticks, and I excavated the clock golf hole. The pea sticks were an accident, Charles having pruned some of the branches off the nut tree by the coal house, left them in a pile on the lawn until he had time to move them. He just had to get on with putting up the nets, he said. Those birds weren't going to beat him. And there Seeley found them and said they made a super ambush, as he could be guaranteed to stay under them for at least 20 minutes after he was first let out in the morning, spying on the birds, leaping out at the bees, and occasionally landing on Sheba. It was obviously worth leaving them there. There they still remain too, though now they have been there for months, with a little cat lurking under them, and people wondering why we haven't moved them. The clock golf hole was deliberate. Solomon, when he was young, had been very fond of clock golf. It kept him on the lawn for ages. One of us putting the ball while Solomon either chased it, tail high across the grass, or practically stood on his head in the hole. He liked it so much that once, when a visitor mislaid her car keys, at a time when Solomon was given to carrying things in his mouth, we'd found those where nobody but he could have put them, down the clock golf hole on the lawn. Over the years, the habit had died out, however. The numbers were somewhere in the woodshed. The hole had long since filled in, until I, hoping it might similarly interest Seeley, found the hole and cleared it out and got out the clubs. It was more than hope. I had the feeling that if Seeley would play this game that was so personally Solomon's, it would prove there was a connecting link, that there was an inherited line of behaviour running through them which would make Seeley more and more like my first friend. It was quite uncanny. One tap of the ball into the hole when the game was ready, and it was as though Solomon was with us all over again. The same exaggerated prancing after the ball, the same clowning around the hole, the same excited tearing onto the lawn when I picked up a club in the kitchen. Sheba had never been interested in clock golf, nor had Sugi. Solomon and Sheba's mother. Was I right? One could get another just the same. Now another big seal point cat crouched by the clock golf hole, while passers-by stared incredulously over the gate. "What's she doing then, keeping goal?" inquired Father Adams, and then, unusually for him, who was never sentimental, "Takes ye back, don't it, watching 'em?" he said. Chapter 16. One by one, a good many things were emerging to take us back. When we first had Seeley, for instance, he'd been very scared of cars. Probably his mother had warned him to be careful of them. When one came past anyway, even if he was safely in the garden, Seeley would crouch in terror and run indoors. "At least we won't have that worry," we'd said, remembering the time when Solomon only had to spot a car parked in the lane to be under it, on it, or preferably, if the owner had left a window open, inside it, before we could say Jack Robinson. And now here we were with the lighter evenings, people parking their cars to go for a stroll, and Seeley at 9 months old, as interested in motor vehicles as Solomon had been. Under them, on them, he hadn't yet found one with the window open, but he peered interestedly in through the windscreens, just as Solomon had done. "Doesn't he look like him?" I said as we sped out to get him in and to wipe the telltale footprints off yet another car. "He does," said Charles. "And he acts like him too. I only hope we have the strength to keep on running." Spring was now turning to early summer. "You couldn't win," said Charles, coming in from his fruit trees one day. He'd kept the frost off them, he'd kept the birds off them, and now guess what? He'd gone up to see how they were doing, and there was a blasted snail on one of them, under the net, right on the top, just sticking its neck out for a shoot. It looked like being a good crop all the same, and the weather was warm, and the grass was high, and nature was absolutely abounding. Seeley was in his 7th heaven. One day Charles found him out by the stream, happily ambushing the bees. He'd discovered the spot where they came down for water and was crouched there watching them land. Another day, seeing him intently studying another part of the stream, in the long grass beside the gate, Charles investigated cautiously to see what was there. Seeley, saucer-eyed, was watching a toad. "A big one and beautifully marked," said Charles. "We very rarely saw them around ourselves." Now, too, the time was approaching for the village fete, where for the 2nd year running, Annabel had been asked to give donkey rides. We'd been a bit apprehensive the first time because she wasn't used to it, but she'd behaved herself very well. She'd given 28 donkey rides and earned 14 shillings and only stopped dead twice. Since then, what was more, she'd been trained. A teenager in the village who was an excellent rider herself had taught her small sister to ride on Annabel, who was now a fully fledged riding donkey. They used to take her out on Saturday afternoons. At first, Marion had to lead her, or perhaps tow her would be a better description, since Annabel wasn't very cooperative. But within a few weeks, they were returning to say that Annabel had trotted, Annabel had cantered, and once, I regret to say, that Annabel had got down and rolled and Julie had fallen off. I watched sometimes from the window as the procession went by, Annabel marching independently ahead now, while Marion walked some way behind. Annabel was obviously imagining she was a proper horse, and Julie sat her well. There was one occasion, admittedly, when Annabel turned to the right as she was passing her stable and marched in, Julie and all, but Marion went in after them, and the next moment Annabel, complete with rider, complacently reappeared. All in all, she was pretty well trained now, and we weren't worrying about her behaviour at the fete at all. What we were concerned with was that she should look well groomed and have a shining coat. Annabel's own desire being to roll in the dust and look awful. I combed her, I brushed her, not too hard, otherwise her coat would come right out, as we were now on the verge of summer. It wouldn't look like Annabel without her furry coat. We could start getting it out in earnest when the fete was over. That was what we thought. I noticed her idly rubbing her back under a branch in her field one day. I must remember to saw that branch off, I told myself. Annabel liked to rub herself while she was thinking, and if we weren't careful, she'd look like a poodle. Then, of course, I forgot about it, until 2 days later we were putting her in at night, and Charles said, "Good Lord, look at her back." It was typical. A week to go to the fete, and Annabel hadn't just rubbed the hair off in patches. She'd scrubbed herself completely raw. Not, fortunately, where her riding rug went. Annabel is too small for the smallest saddle, but right where the edge of it would come across her withers, just where it would be particularly noticeable. "People will think she's got mange," said Charles despairingly. "Honestly, you'd think she'd done it on purpose." Perhaps she had too, knowing Annabel, though to do her justice, all animals love to scratch. Anyway, I covered the patches with boracic powder to dry them up, put talcum powder on top of that in the hope that the scent might deter the flies, and thus, having sawn off the branch so she couldn't do it again, we put her in her field next morning and awaited the inevitable comments. "What's the matter with she then?" inquired Father Adams, who never misses anything. "What's that smell round here?" demanded Fred Ferry, turning up almost simultaneously and suspiciously sniffing the air. They shook their heads sadly when I told them. "She won't be giving no rides," they said. She did, though. Her back was perfectly healed by Saturday, and with a tartan car rug on top of her usual one, nobody noticed the hairless bits. 35 donkey rides she gave on this occasion, and I, trudging round with her, was practically on my knees. That was that obligation over. And now, said Charles, we ought to be thinking about a holiday. He reckoned the fruit and the vegetables were just about right to leave. The nets were doing their stuff and keeping off the birds. By gosh, we were going to have some apples. We were going to have plenty of tomatoes too, though the peas weren't looking so bright. Field mice were getting at them and eating off all the shoots. Eventually, he didn't like doing it, but we couldn't let the crop be spoiled like that. Charles went off to buy some mouse traps. He got them in Woolworths in the nearest town and was much intrigued to see the assistant, when he asked for them, pick them up one by one from the counter and carefully examine them. Are some better than others? Charles asked with interest. Didn't that, said the assistant. Little perishers of kids are always coming in here and setting the ruddy things. You'd never believe the times they've gone off on my fingers. Charles reluctantly caught a few of the marauders, and then the remaining peas grew too big for mice to bother with, and he was able to discard the traps. Seeley caught a few mice too. He was quicker at it than Solomon, though he had the same capacity for letting them get away. Sheba had been a tremendous mouser in her time, but she didn't bother it with it much now. Excuse me. So we were most intrigued by her behaviour one morning. Seeley had caught a shrew, and to my relief, had promptly lost it, so I didn't have to go to the rescue. Sheba sat languidly by, apparently not even looking. That was for children. Her mousing days were past. She couldn't be bothered with such trivia, her expression implied. I was absolutely amazed, therefore, when Charles came in a while later and said that Sheba, who hadn't been outside the gate in ages, was out in the lane with Seeley, and they were watching for mice side by side. What on earth do you think that's in aid of? I said. He's probably told her that he keeps losing them, said Charles, and she's got him out there giving him a lesson. They were certainly fond of one another. Whenever Seeley, returning from one of his expeditions, went running up to her with his murr, murr, murr of greeting, Sheba would give him a deeper murr, murr back. She was still his number one pin-up girl too. Often when they sat together, he'd give a lick behind her ears like a doting parent tidying a child's hair. And then he'd look at us most proudly. Not bad, was she? He was obviously asking. We learned how much she really meant to him, though, the day I put him in his cage on his own. They'd been going in there together daily for about 6 weeks without any fuss. Indeed, it worked so well that Sugar and Spice's owners had now put up a similar cage for them. That greyhound came to visit so often, they said, they couldn't stand the strain. This was one of Sheba's off days, however. She didn't fancy her breakfast. She wanted to sleep on our bed, so we decided to let her stay there. And as it was a sunny day and it seemed a shame to keep him indoors, to put Seeley in the cage on his own. Immediately he was in there, he began to howl. Because Sheba isn't with him, I said, when I finish these letters, I'll let him out and keep an eye on him. By the time I'd done the letters, however, Seeley had let himself out. Unable to get through the laced-up corners, he climbed the wire and, while clinging to one of the front support poles, had chewed a hole clean through what was supposed to be an unbreakable nylon net. Very intelligently done it was too, with every thread that mattered chewed in a determinedly straight line. Now he'd discovered how to do that, I said. We'd have to put the cage up permanently with a proper wire roof. We didn't, though. Next day, Sheba was her normal self. So, pressed for time as usual, I mended the hole with string, put them both in there temporarily, expecting Seeley to chew through the net within minutes. And he just didn't bother. He simply sunned himself happily there with Sheba, occasionally rolling on the rug or getting up to swat a fly, as if the idea of escape had never entered his head. And now, if, as she often does, Sheba goes into the cage voluntarily, it being sheltered in there and strategically placed to catch the sun, Seeley is usually right behind her, just as in bygone days Solomon would have been. They make a happy picture together, and there is no doubt that he has done her tremendous good. Without him, we would probably have lost her, instead of which, a few weeks back, for the first time in years, Sheba rushed skittishly up the damson tree. We had to fetch the ladder to get her down, but not on account of her age. It was midnight, and sitting up there talking to us, Sheba would have tantalized us for hours. She could climb better than Seeley could, couldn't she? I'll say she could. She was right at the very top. It was difficult getting up to her, wasn't it? It certainly was on a dark night with a torch. She'd made us give her lots of attention, hadn't she? Demanded Sheba when we finally got her down. And indoors, watching frustratedly from the window, sat Seeley, wanting to be up the tree with Sheba, he bawled. Well, that was really something, said Charles as we carried her in. Who'd have ever thought we'd see her act like that again? She was good for a few years yet, he reckoned. Which reminded him, what about fixing up that holiday? We'd better ring the Francises and find out when they could take the cats. He'd bet they'd be looking forward to meeting Seeley. Annabelle was going to our local farm where she'd stayed when we were on holiday ever since we'd had her. That marked the passing of the years with us too, from the time when she was so tiny they'd fenced her off from the cows, and she'd crawled indignantly under the barrier and put the herd to flight. There was a year they'd put her in with the heifers, the year they'd put her in with the older cows. The previous year had marked Annabelle's supremacy, when we'd come back and found her in charge of the bull. Call her from the gate, mind, said Mrs. Perdsey when we went to fetch her. William's pretty docile, but it's always best to be sure. William is another character. Earlier that spring, he'd been out in the field adjoining the road with his wives, and as Farmer Percy believed in locking him in every night for safety, not that William was dangerous, but some fool might let him out, one of the features of the local scene had been Farmer Percy calling him at about 5 o'clock every evening and waving a mangold. And William, who loves mangolds as dearly as Seely loves turkey, sprinting across the field and following anticipatorily through the gate, across the road and down to his shed in the farmyard. One Saturday afternoon, however, Farmer Percy went to a football match and wasn't back by 5 o'clock. William waited and waited and waited. After about 20 minutes, the bellows of a bull urgently demanding his mangold began to rend the air. We heard the noise down in the valley and wondered whatever it was. And finally, William, refusing to wait any longer, broke through the hedge, not fortunately into the road, but into a neighbouring garden where, when Farmer Percy returned a short while later, William was still snorting and loudly demanding his mangold, while the owners of the bungalow kept watch on him, not from any fear of his fierceness, but so that he shouldn't run away. This being William, it was no surprise to us when we went to the gate and saw him grazing meekly in the field with Annabel in full command. She was only about half as tall as he was, but there she stood, queening it over him and a cow and 2 calves like Cleopatra in the land of Egypt. It was a good thing we didn't go into the field at that. He followed her right to the gate. What she'd get up to this year, goodness only knew. There was a new Scotch collie for her to play with, and Mrs. Percy always spoiled her. What Seely would get up to at Howestoft we didn't know either, and we certainly weren't looking forward to the journey. Howling all the way, said Charles, shuddering at the very thought, but he bet he'd like it when he got there. Remember the first time Solomon and Sheba went there as kittens, he said, and they'd liked the earth box so much they'd gone to sleep in it. I remembered so many things. We were right in having Seely. He has been good for Sheba. He has been good for us. The household is normal once more. Even as I have finished this book, I've seen something I never expected to see again. Seely and Sheba sitting side by side in the kitchen, their tails affectionately crossed. If sometimes I look across to where the daffodils are and say, "Oh, Solomon, Solomon, Solomon," nobody ever hears me. I whisper it to myself.